Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we're going to be talking about judging, but I don't want this to be about how judging is bad in HEMA, but specifically how it can be made better by utilizing a scenario, and specifically a fight that's just playing right now, where it is basically impossible to judge accurately. I believe that one of the best ways to understand judging is to put it into its worst and most broken context so that you can understand why it broke and why it failed, and then do something about fixing it later. Which is why specifically, as I go through this fight, I'm going to be talking about the ways in which the fencers could have done things differently in order to better sell their attacks and their defenses to the judges. So that, again, nobody starts doing this in a tournament, but specifically so that judges will know when their fighters are doing that to them, and they can learn how to avoid it. So with that, we're going to start off. So right off the bat, this is a rapier and dagger tournament. And the reason I chose a rapier dagger tournament to talk about judging is because rapier and dagger tournaments are the hardest to judge. There are two people moving their weapons extremely fast, and they both have two of them. You have to pay attention to 4 different weapons hitting various kinds of targets. Not only that, but a thrust is generally one of the hardest things to judge quality on. A cut can be somewhat easier because it makes a loud noise, but when you're using a thin bladed rapier and a dagger, you have to pay attention to where somebody stabs, and oftentimes this is where questions of target location become the most blurry. The size of a tip of a rapier is not even an inch wide, and you have to know exactly whether or not it hit them in the arm or the shoulder or the inner torso right next to the armpit, and you have to do it with an extremely fast weapon and an extremely fast tempo. So rapier and dagger is really, really hard. So as we go into this first exchange, just remember that this is even worse than longsword. So for the first exchange, we see a little bit of a back and forth, an attempted thrust from the fighter on the left, parried by the fighter on the right, and then the fighter on the right comes in and throws a very deep stab, or at least a deep looking stab, while fencer on the left gets hit and then returns with a thrust of their own. So just watching this at full speed, you might think, oh, well, it looks pretty clean, like yellow stabbed something really good, and then red tried to get a little bit of an afterblow, but was perhaps a little out of tempo. But if we slow this down, what we notice is that, in fact, the yellow thrust went to the arm. And one of the great things about this exchange is that it shows how difficult angle can be for a particular judge. What we see here is that both the judges on this side of the camera, closest to the camera, show an arm stab, whereas the judge on the far side of the camera, who was not able to see exactly which section of the body or the arm it hit, said deep. Everybody discounted the red afterblow as being out of tempo, which I think is more or less down to the individual tournament, but it's worth noting that no one even noticed or seemed to notice that a red stab in the afterblow actually happened. One of the reasons that we can look at this and learn from judging as a specific skill into itself is what we need to remember is that afterblow timings are going to happen sometimes regardless of whether or not a fencer thinks that it was valid. You can sort of see in the body language of fencer on the left here that after they get stabbed in the arm and it makes this big dramatic bend, they almost sort of give up emotionally, and when they throw their afterblow, they throw it more or less as a kind of afterthought. And what that means is that the judges, who may or may not be thinking about whether or not that was in tempo, or maybe didn't even see it, don't necessarily acknowledge that it even happened. The fighter on the left might think, oh, well, it was out of tempo, it shouldn't have counted anyway, when, in fact, perhaps under the rule set of this particular tournament, it would have been. Perhaps if some of these judges had seen, or didn't see, that thrust, they would have had a different outcome. But more importantly, what this does is it tells you something that you should absolutely always be doing in your tournaments, and that is throwing afterblows. It's very, very important, even in a tournament where afterblows don't count, to throw something at least one tempo after you think the fight is over, because the reality is that judges miss things, and sometimes you think things are far more valid than they actually are. And the result can be one in which you get stabbed what you think was very cleanly, but actually it maybe hit the front of your guard, or it skipped off, or you're just not used to the rule set and you didn't realize that it wasn't going to be counted. And you just sit there and do nothing. You shut down, and then it allows your opponent to get a follow-up attack. What you have to make sure of is that every time you get hit or land a hit, you throw one more defensive or offensive action after that final attack, because you need to make sure that, given the unthinkable option that the judges just flat out didn't see it, that they're going to see the second one. So as we move into our second exchange, what we see is the complete opposite of what happened in the first exchange. In the first exchange, you saw a pretty clear thrust that lands, just a question of targeting, and a pretty clear afterblow that just wasn't quite sold well enough. In the second one, we see both fencers employing the afterblow technique, but they're making another critical mistake. Now, in my opinion, this exchange is a double with nothing really meaningful happening here, because as you can see, especially when you slow it down, both fencers are trying to cut the other person in the head, and under this rule set, anything other than a cut to the head didn't count. Meanwhile, both people are doing a pretty decent job of zoning out the other person's blade with their sword, and ensuring that even if some contact is being made to the head with the blade, it's getting tied up by a dagger, and chances are it's losing pretty much all of its momentum. Now, what I want to talk about here is that while both participants are throwing good afterblows, and they're throwing it after when they think they probably got hit, they're making another mistake, which is that they're not closing or opening the distance enough to properly end the exchange. You see, I think it's not enough to just throw an afterblow, assuming that it's going to end the exchange, and it's definitely not enough to feel like something has already ended the exchange and to throw an afterblow after that. What you have to do is you have to put in one last defensive movement-based measure in order to ensure that the exchange ends. And in my opinion, one of the best things to do is to jam up into your opponent. Now, in Rapier and Dagger, this is a little bit complicated because that's where the shanks come out. But for the purpose of talking about longsword, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare this a little bit to boxing. In boxing, people throw combinations and exchanges don't stop on one punch, obviously. But in boxing, it's generally considered a smart idea to save your strongest punch for the last in the combination. And what happens then is that if you're getting punched a ton of times in the head, what boxers will do is they'll close in the distance really tight and tie everything up. They can pretty much surmise that the second or third punch in that combination, which isn't the power punch, isn't going to be enough to knock them out as they're coming forward. And once they tie up, that power punch is taken out of the equation. And something similar can be done with swords. Every time you end an exchange, you should close the distance in to get into a grapple, specifically because a grapple is a great way of ending the exchange, even if it's one in which that you're probably going to be losing. And the reason is that messy exchanges like this often happen because people are able to throw continuous afterblow after afterblow after afterblow, and what happens is, as a judge, you see that giant flurry and that giant mess, and you just throw it out. You say, double, probably, I don't know, and suddenly your mind is no longer on talking about tempo or first intention or who moved first or who attacked first, and you just want to be done with it. So in effect, to try to cut down the messiness of an exchange, a grapple is a great way to do that. Similarly, you can explosively basically run out of the ring. Now, with Rapier and Dagger, this is a lot more obvious of an option because if you try to close in for a dagger or to a grapple, you're going to get daggered. But if you try to leave very heavily, what can happen is that you're going to take away the wind out of those second or third afterblows. And what it's going to do is it's going to give the judges less information to think about so they can focus on what actually happened in the initial actions or in the secondary actions rather than just giving up halfway through and throwing it all out. So the next exchange I want to talk about is one in which we have a little bit of what looks like a double hand thrust. Now, when you watch this full speed, what looks like is that fighter on the right goes for a little bit of a hand cut. They look like they miss, and then fencer on the left just seems to separate. All of a sudden, at the end of the exchange, fencer on the right is acknowledging a hit to their own hand. What happened? And this is another one of those things that makes Rapier and Dagger so difficult, but also something that you see a lot in Longsword, and that is the fact that a lot of times you will feel yourself get hit in a tournament, and the attack was garbage. Now, if we watch this in slow motion, what we essentially see is that fencer on the right does throw their hand cut, and they miss clean. They go past the target on their right side or inner side, and then they come right back up on the other side without the blade ever stopping. It's pretty obvious that this is a miss. Not to mention the fact that the guard that was in place during this attack probably would have protected them even if they had been on target. But the exact same thing can be said of the counterattack that's thrown by fencer on the left. What appears to happen is that after fencer on the right has missed their attack and is starting to pull away, they throw a little bit of an extension and they tap the underside of their hand with their blade. Now, is this considered a legal cut? That's not for me to decide. That's for the judges, or more importantly, the tournament rules to decide. But the reason I want to bring this up is specifically because this is a very, very good example of someone who is trying to do their best to basically judge the fight for the judges and has sold themselves short a little bit. In my opinion, after watching this a couple times, the counterattack from the fencer on the left just isn't sufficient. It has virtually no rotation, but chances are, thanks to the fact that fencer on the right is wearing rapier gloves and he kind of just got hit in a section where he didn't expect to get hit, it felt really good. And it might have probably cut him if it was a real sword, not that I'm particularly concerned with something like that. But all in all, he ends up acknowledging the hit and giving his opponent a point. And this is something that you see a lot in tournaments that I kind of wish would go away, particularly because the gamesmanship of acknowledging hits sort of circles the globe and on the one hand does something very good for the fight, it also does something very bad. And this is what I mean. When you acknowledge a hit, you're essentially judging for the judges. But what you're also doing is that you're trying to say that your experience was significantly more valid than the ones that was experienced by 2 or 3 other people who are focused on trying to judge the thing. Now, obviously, feeling a hit can give you some extremely important and pertinent information as to what happened. However, as someone who's watched a lot of footage of fights, I can tell you right now that I've watched footage of my fights where I've been hurt, and that attack was not good. There are a lot of instances where the weapons that we use can cause physical pain or damage, even though they weren't very good attacks. And sometimes the exact opposite can happen, where something that was really, really good can do absolutely nothing, and we don't even feel it because our armor and our equipment worked very well. And what I would say for people who are trying to do this in a tournament is try to get away from acknowledging your own hits. Because oftentimes, I say like probably 50% of the time, you're right, but the judges should have seen it, which means that you need to be doing something else in order to sell your attacks. Or you didn't actually get hit as well. The judges did see it, and they're the ones who are actually right in this situation, in which case you're just throwing away points and you're throwing away a fight, and more importantly, you're making the judges doubt themselves. And regardless of whether or not that's something that should be able to be done to a judge, obviously if we were all perfect robots, we would never doubt ourselves and we would just throw up what we think we saw every single time without any kind of outside influence. But the reality is that if you're in a fight, and especially if it's a fight between 2 people who are, higher ranked or have a little bit of a higher social standing, or people think that they're really good fighters and they start calling things that the judges didn't see, this is influencing the judges. Regardless of whether or not you're right, you are influencing the outcome of the fight. And in my opinion, you're probably setting a precedent where you're going to be doing more harm than good. So the final thing and the final exchange I want to go over here is this final exchange from the fight. Now, as you can see by the scoreboard, it's actually physically impossible for a fencer on the left to win. Now, as this exchange goes, fencer on the left throws a little bit of a lunge, fencer on the right parries it out of the way, and returns a cut to the head. Now, if you watch this exchange back in slow motion, it's not exactly clear whether or not the fencer on the left really landed that initial thrust. It doesn't look like it did, or if it did, it didn't land for very long. But also, it's worth pointing out that the dagger block that came in to parry the headshot from fencer on the right did look also pretty decent. It might have gotten through a little bit and made a little bit of a noise, but as far as quality goes, it was a little bit on the line. The point here being, though, that the second that headshot landed, or didn't land, fencer on the left turned around looking a little bit dejected because at this point, they clearly had already given up on the fight. Now, I don't want to be too hard on them because obviously, objectively speaking, the fight was already over. But I want to point this out because this is something people do a lot in their fencing, even when they do have a chance of winning. And the reason I want to bring this up is because this whole time I've been talking about selling your attacks and selling your things to the judges, when obviously, in my opinion, the opposite ends up happening a lot more. I see far more people who, through their own body language and the things that they do when they walk back to their corner, essentially tell the judges that they're wrong in trying to give them points. And this, I think, results in far more lost and bad judging than anything else. So, if I'm going to tell you to sell your stuff to the judges, I think most of what I have to tell people is actually just don't undersell it. Don't sell your opponent's win to the judges, because you might actually get it to work. I think a lot of people are scared of the Olympic fencing style of selling your points, where you scream and pump your fist and throw your mask on the ground and yell really loud whenever you think you landed a point, specifically in order to try to influence the judges into thinking that it happened. But in my opinion, at least in HEMA, I think the opposite is what happens far more often. I think far more points are thrown out because people either self-judge their stuff as being bad, or more importantly, they judge their fight as already over before the judges have even made a deliberation. And they influence the judges far more that way than the opposite. I think that if you want to have a really good tournament experience, at the end of the day, there's not much you can do besides some of the things that I talked about earlier in order to make your judging more accurate. But there is a lot that you can not do in order to not make judging harder. And I think that's the key takeaway from this, that if you want to have good judges, there's actually a lot more than you think that you can do to make sure that you are not influencing the judges negatively against you. So with that, if you think I'm right, feel free to comment down in the bottom, or if you think I'm dead wrong, do the same. But otherwise, if you'd like to see more fight breakdowns, I'm going to be making another video next week, and I hope to see you next time.